They came from the sea, but where they came from originally, no one could say with certainty. The records call them by different names: Peleset and Denian, Shekelesh and Weshesh, groups whose origins remain mysterious even now. They appear in the historical record suddenly, as attackers, as invaders, as peoples in motion. They brought destruction to some places, settled in others, left their mark on the end of the Bronze Age, even though we still do not fully understand who they were. The Egyptian inscriptions give us our most detailed information, though even this is limited and filtered through Egyptian perspective. Merenptah's inscriptions, recording his defeat of an invasion around 1208 BCE, list several groups among the attackers. But it is in the reign of Rameses III, about 30 years later, that we get the most detailed account, inscribed on the walls of his mortuary temple at Medinet Habu. Rameses III describes a massive movement of peoples, a confederation of attackers who destroyed kingdoms in their path, who came by both land and sea, who threatened Egypt itself. The inscription speaks of foreign countries conspiring together, of no land standing before them, of the destruction of Hatti, the Hittite Empire, Carchemish, Arzawa, Cyprus. Whether this is accurate history or Egyptian exaggeration is debated, but the inscription claims that these peoples destroyed the greatest powers of the Bronze Age before turning toward Egypt. The relief carvings at Medinet Habu show two great battles. One is a land battle, showing Egyptian forces defeating enemies in chariots and on foot. The other is a sea battle, showing Egyptian ships engaged with enemy vessels, archers shooting from the decks, enemies falling into the water. These scenes, carved in stone, preserved the Egyptian version of events: Rameses III as the great defender who saved Egypt when all around was falling into chaos. The Sea Peoples, as modern historians have come to call them, were probably not a unified group with a single origin or purpose. They seem to have been a coalition or confederation, different groups moving together, sharing enemies and perhaps objectives, but not necessarily coming from the same place or sharing the same ultimate goals. Some may have been refugees fleeing destruction in their homelands. Some may have been opportunistic raiders taking advantage of disruption. Some may have been seeking new homes after their own lands became untenable. The Peleset, one of the groups named in Egyptian inscriptions, are usually identified with the Philistines who appear later in biblical texts, settled in the southern Levantine coast. The Sherdan may be connected to Sardinia, the Shekelesh perhaps to Sicily. But these identifications are tentative, based on similarity of names, separated by centuries and uncertain transmission. We cannot be certain where any of these groups originally came from. Some scholars have suggested that the Sea Peoples came from the Aegean, perhaps refugees from the destructions that ended the Mycenaean palaces. Others suggest origins in western Anatolia or from various points around the Mediterranean. The truth may be that they came from many places, that Sea Peoples is a catch-all term for multiple groups of migrants and raiders, united only in that they moved by sea and attacked Bronze Age kingdoms in the early 12th century BCE. What we can say with more confidence is that they were effective fighters. They defeated or contributed to defeating some of the most powerful kingdoms of the age. Whether they did this through superior military tactics, through numbers, through the element of surprise, or because they attacked kingdoms already weakened by other problems, is unclear. Probably all of these factors played a role. The destructions of the Bronze Age collapse were not all simultaneous. They occurred over several decades, roughly between 1200 and 1150 BCE, with different sites destroyed at different times. But there seems to have been a peak of destruction around 1200 BCE, when many major sites show evidence of burning and abandonment. This coincides with the period of Sea People's movements, suggesting connection, even if we cannot always prove causation. Ugarit was destroyed around 1200 BCE. The city burned, its inhabitants killed or fled. The archaeological evidence shows a sudden and violent end. Houses were abandoned with possessions still inside. The palace burned, the archives preserved by the fire that destroyed the building. The letters mentioned earlier, the desperate requests for aid, were found in the ruins, undelivered or unsent. The city was never rebuilt. The site was abandoned, eventually buried by sand, rediscovered by archaeologists in the 1920s. The destruction at Ugarit appears to have been thorough. The city did not decline gradually. It ended suddenly, in fire and violence. Who destroyed it? The Sea Peoples are the obvious suspects, given the timing and the content of the letters mentioning enemy ships. But we cannot be entirely certain. It could have been opportunistic attack by neighboring peoples taking advantage of Ugarit's weakened state. It could have been internal conflict that got out of hand. But the evidence points to external attack, to the city falling to enemies who came by sea. Similar destruction is visible at many other sites along the Levantine coast. Sidon was destroyed. Byblos was abandoned. Inland cities also fell. The kingdom-level political organization collapsed. The palace systems that had coordinated the economy and administration broke down. When the archaeological record resumes after a gap, the cultures are different, simpler, more localized. In Cyprus, major sites show destruction layers from this period. Enkomi, one of the island's most important cities, was damaged, though it recovered for a time before final abandonment. The copper production that had been Cyprus's economic foundation declined sharply. Whether this was because the mines were depleted, because the workforce fled, or because the destruction disrupted the organizational systems needed for large-scale mining, the effect was the same. Less copper meant less bronze, further weakening the economic foundations of the surviving kingdoms. The Hittite Empire fell during this period, though the exact sequence of events remains unclear. The capital at Hattusa was abandoned around 1200 BCE. There is evidence of destruction by fire in some areas, but other areas seem to have been systematically dismantled rather than violently destroyed. This suggests that the end may have been complex, perhaps internal collapse, followed by or accompanied by external attack, the population fleeing or relocating before enemies could arrive. The Hittite royal line disappears from the historical record. The great king who had corresponded as equal with Egypt, who had ruled from the Mediterranean to the Euphrates, left no known successor. The empire fragmented. Some cities in southern Anatolia and northern Syria maintained elements of Hittite culture, becoming what scholars call Neo-Hittite states. but these were small kingdoms compared to the empire that had existed. The power that had dominated Anatolia for 4 centuries was gone. Whether the Sea Peoples destroyed the Hittite Empire is unclear. The Egyptian inscription claims they did, but Egyptian inscriptions should not be taken as unbiased historical sources. It is possible that the Hittite Empire collapsed from internal problems, drought and famine causing administrative breakdown, rebellions by subject peoples, the palace system simply failing under accumulated stress. The Sea Peoples may have attacked cities already weakened or abandoned, taking credit for destructions they did not cause or merely accelerating a collapse already underway. In Greece, the Mycenaean palaces fell one by one. Pylos burned around 1180 BCE, its destruction so complete that the site was abandoned and eventually forgotten, not to be rediscovered until modern archaeological excavations. The Linear B tablets in the palace archive were baked hard by the fire, preserving them, but also marking the end of the administrative system that created them. The Megaron collapsed, the storerooms burned, the workshops were destroyed, the people fled or were killed, and the palace was never rebuilt. Mycenae itself survived longer, but was eventually destroyed around 1100 BCE. The great citadel with its lion gate, the palaces and temples inside, all burned. The population declined sharply. The site was occupied in later periods, but never again as a palace center. The Cyclopean walls remained, too massive to dismantle, becoming the sheep pens and boundary markers of later farmers who had forgotten what the walls had once protected. Tiryns followed a similar pattern. Thebes was destroyed. Athens survived, though diminished, its Bronze Age palace gone, but the site continuously occupied. Many of the smaller settlements in the Peloponnese were abandoned. The archaeological surveys show a dramatic reduction in site numbers, suggesting major population decline. Whether people died, fled overseas, or dispersed into smaller settlements in marginal areas, the dense settlement pattern of the Mycenaean period gave way to sparse occupation. Were the Mycenaean destructions caused by Sea Peoples? The traditional interpretation has been that they were, that raiders from the sea, possibly Mycenaean refugees who had become pirates, or other groups from around the Mediterranean, attacked the palace centers. But the evidence is ambiguous. There are no inscriptions describing attacks. The archaeological evidence shows destruction by fire. But fire could have many causes. Some scholars now suggest that internal factors may have been primary. Economic collapse following the disruption of trade. Social unrest as palace systems failed to provide expected support. Earthquake damage that could not be repaired. The abandonment of palaces might have been followed by squatters moving in, accidentally starting fires, leading to the burning we see archaeologically. Or there may have been warfare between Mycenaean kingdoms, each trying to secure resources at the expense of neighbors, leading to mutual destruction. The truth may involve multiple factors: external raids, internal conflicts, economic collapse, natural disasters, all occurring together in a cascading failure where each problem made others worse. A drought reduces agricultural surplus, making it harder for the palace to support its dependents. Soldiers and craftsmen, unpaid, might rebel or depart. The weakened palace cannot defend against raids or maintain order. Raids disrupt what trade remains. Economic collapse leads to more raids. Each element of the system's failure accelerates others. In this chaos, groups of people on the move, seeking safety or opportunity, would have found Bronze Age cities vulnerable. Whether they called themselves Sea Peoples or were called that by others, whether they were organized raiders or desperate refugees turned violent, they would have contributed to the destructions. But they may have been as much a symptom of the collapse as a cause, people displaced by the same forces that were bringing down the palace systems. Egypt survived, but not unscathed. Rameses III fought at least 2 major campaigns against the Sea Peoples, one early in his reign, around 1177 BCE, another later. The battles depicted at Medinet Habu show Egyptian victory, and indeed, Egypt did survive when other kingdoms fell. But the cost was high. The campaigns strained Egyptian resources. The invasions disrupted the delta. The loss of trading partners in Syria and Anatolia hurt the Egyptian economy. After Rameses III, Egypt entered a slow decline. The new kingdom continued for another century, but with diminishing power and prosperity. The pharaohs who followed Rameses III ruled over a kingdom less wealthy, less powerful, less able to project influence beyond its borders. The great age of Egyptian empire was ending. Egypt would continue as a civilization, but it would never again dominate the eastern Mediterranean as it had in the new kingdom. Some of the Sea Peoples settled in areas they had attacked. The Peleset, the Philistines, established themselves in the southern Levantine coast, in cities like Ashkelon and Gaza. They adopted some elements of local culture, but maintained distinctive characteristics, pottery styles that show Aegean influences, practices that mark them as culturally different from their Canaanite neighbors. The biblical accounts of conflict between Israelites and Philistines reflect this period of settlement and adaptation. Other groups may have settled elsewhere. Some may have returned to wherever they came from. Some may have died in the fighting or from disease and hardship that accompanied their migrations. The sources tell us only fragments, glimpses of movement and conflict, leaving much to speculation. The scale of population movement during this period is difficult to determine. The Egyptian inscriptions speak of tens of thousands of attackers, but Egyptian numbers are often exaggerated for propaganda purposes. The actual scale may have been smaller, though still significant. Even relatively small groups of armed raiders could do tremendous damage to Bronze Age cities, especially if those cities were already weakened by other problems. The sea, which had been a highway connecting the Bronze Age world, became during this period a source of danger. The safety of maritime trade depended on predictable conditions, on knowing which waters were safe, which coasts offered friendly ports. When groups of raiders operated unpredictably, when any ship might be a threat, maritime trade became extremely hazardous. Merchants who had made careers from shipping goods across the Mediterranean either retired from the business or died attempting it. The ships of the Sea Peoples, depicted in Egyptian reliefs, appear to be sailing vessels with single masts and oars for additional propulsion. They are not obviously different from merchant vessels of the period. suggesting that the Sea Peoples may have included or recruited experienced sailors, people who knew how to navigate, how to handle ships, where to find water and supplies. These were not barbarians unfamiliar with the sea, but people who had maritime experience. The military effectiveness of the Sea Peoples suggests some level of organization and capability. They defeated or contributed to defeating kingdoms with professional armies. Whether they achieved this through superior tactics, better weapons, or simply through the disruption they caused is unclear. The Egyptians who defeated them do not dwell on details of Sea Peoples' military methods, focusing instead on Egyptian heroism and divine favor. The motivations of the Sea Peoples, whatever we call them, were probably varied. Some may have been fleeing destruction in their homelands, climate change or warfare making their original homes untenable, forcing migration. Some may have been opportunistic raiders, taking advantage of weakened kingdoms. Some may have been seeking new lands to settle, pushing out established populations. The movements may have started for one reason and continued for others. Momentum building as success encouraged more people to join. The impact of the Sea Peoples on the Bronze Age collapse remains debated among scholars. Are they the primary cause, the destroyers who brought down kingdoms? Are they a secondary factor, raiders who attacked kingdoms already weakened by economic and environmental problems? Or are they largely a symptom, refugees and migrants, created by the same forces that caused the collapse, visible in the historical record, mainly because Egypt fought and recorded fighting them? The current scholarly consensus tends toward the multi-causal view. The Sea Peoples were real. They did attack and destroy cities. They did contribute to the collapse. But they operated in a context of drought and economic disruption, of trade network breakdown and palace system failure. They were one factor among many, important but not solely responsible. The Bronze Age collapse was a perfect storm of problems, and the Sea Peoples were part of that storm. As evening came over the ruins of Ugarit, over the abandoned palace at Hattusa, over the burned remains of Pylos, the world had changed profoundly. The ships that had carried copper and tin no longer sailed those routes. The merchants who had known every port from Cyprus to Crete were gone, dead or retired, their knowledge lost. The scribes who had recorded the palace economies no longer pressed marks into clay. There were no palaces left to administer, no surpluses to account for. The Sea Peoples, whoever they were, wherever they came from, had helped to end a world. Whether they meant to or not, whether they understood what they were doing or were simply trying to survive in desperate circumstances, their movements and attacks contributed to the greatest transformation the Mediterranean world had seen in 1,000 years. The Bronze Age, with its palaces and its networks, its scribes and its bronze, was ending. What would replace it was not yet clear. The fire started somewhere in the palace complex, perhaps in the kitchens where cooking fires had burned all day, perhaps in a workshop where a furnace overheated or coals were not properly extinguished. Perhaps it was deliberate, set by attackers or by people fleeing, destroying what they couldn't take or what they did not want enemies to have. However it started, once fire took hold in a Bronze Age palace, it spread quickly. The structures were built of stone foundations and mud brick walls, wooden beams supporting roofs and upper floors. The wooden elements were often imported cedar, expensive and valuable, but no less flammable for their cost. Once fire reached the timbers, it moved through the building, heating the stone, causing the mud brick to crumble, collapsing roofs onto floors, bringing down walls in cascades of rubble and ash. At Pylos, the evidence suggests the palace burned in a single catastrophic fire. The Linear B tablets found in the archive room were baked hard by the intense heat, preserving them. If the fire had been less hot, the tablets would have dissolved back into mud. If there had been time to rescue the archives, the tablets would have been removed or destroyed. Their preservation suggests sudden disaster, no warning or insufficient time to save anything. The building overcome by fire and collapsing, while the tablets remained in their storage places. The intensity of fire needed to bake clay tablets hard is considerable, well over 700 degrees Celsius. At such temperatures, human survival is impossible. Anyone caught in the palace when it burned this hot would have died quickly. The archaeological evidence from many Bronze Age destruction sites shows human remains, people who did not escape, whose bones were found in the ruins. These were not peaceful deaths. Whether the fires at various sites were set by attackers or started accidentally during chaotic evacuations or resulted from fighting, the effect was the same. The palaces that had been centers of power and administration, of economic coordination and cultural life, were reduced to ruins. The wooden elements burned away completely, leaving only ash. The stone foundations remained, would remain for millennia, but the buildings themselves were gone. At Mycenaean, the palace destruction occurred later than at many other sites, perhaps around 1100 BCE. The delay suggests that Mycenaean may have survived the initial wave of destructions, may have even benefited temporarily from refugees fleeing other sites, craftsmen and warriors seeking a remaining center of power. But eventually, Mycenaean too fell. The palace burned, the citadel was damaged, the population declined precipitously. The Lion Gate survived, too massive to destroy easily. The great stones fitted together so well that they remained standing. But the buildings the gate had protected were gone. The palace with its megaron, the storerooms with their pithoi, the workshops with their forges and looms, all destroyed. Mycenaean continued to be inhabited in later periods, but never again as a palace center, never again as a capital of a kingdom. Tiryns met a similar fate. The massive walls, some of the most impressive fortifications in all of Greece, proved insufficient protection. The palace burned, the galleries within the thickness of the walls stood empty. The site was largely abandoned. Later, Greeks, looking at these walls, could not believe that ordinary humans had built them. They attributed the construction to Cyclopes, one-eyed giants of legend, because no other explanation seemed adequate for such monumental architecture. The destructions were not all identical. Some sites show evidence of earthquake damage before or during the fires. Walls had cracks, repairs had been attempted. It is possible that earthquakes weakened structures, making them more vulnerable to attack or to accidental fires. It is possible that earthquakes were the primary cause of destruction at some sites, fires starting in damaged buildings overwhelming efforts to control them. But many of the destructions show signs of violence, arrowheads found in destruction layers, evidence of bodies lying where they fell. Destruction that appears deliberate rather than accidental. At some sites, valuable objects that would normally have been taken by fleeing residents were left behind, suggesting people fled in such haste that they could not gather their possessions, or that they were unable to flee at all. The palace systems, complex and sophisticated as they were also fragile. They depended on continuous functioning of many interconnected elements. The scribes needed to keep records, the storerooms needed to maintain supplies, the craftsmen needed to produce goods, the farmers needed to deliver taxes, the soldiers needed to maintain security. If any of these elements failed, the entire system was stressed. When the palaces burned, they took with them not just buildings, but systems. The administrative apparatus that coordinated economic activity was gone. The scribes who knew how to read and write, who understood the accounting systems, were dead or scattered. The Linear B script, used only for palace administration, became useless when there were no palaces to administer. Within a generation, no one could read the tablets, the knowledge lost. The craft specialists who had worked in palace workshops were also dispersed. The bronze smiths who knew the correct proportions of copper and tin, the potters who had mastered complex forms, the fresco painters who had decorated palace walls, all of these specialists depended on palace support. Without palaces to employ them, to provide materials and guarantee food, these craftsmen had to find other ways to survive. Some skills were maintained, others were lost. The loss of literacy was particularly significant. The Linear B script was not simple. It required years of training to learn, more years to master. It was not used for literature or private correspondence, only for palace administration. When the palaces fell, there was no longer any reason to learn the script. The last generation of scribes died, and with them died the ability to read or write in Linear B. Greece would be illiterate for approximately 400 years, until the alphabet was borrowed from the Phoenicians in the 8th century BCE. At Ugarit, the situation was somewhat different. The city was thoroughly destroyed, burned, and abandoned. But Ugarit had used several different writing systems, including an alphabetic cuneiform script that was simpler than syllabic systems. This script survived in the broader region, evolved into the Phoenician alphabet, eventually giving rise to Greek, Roman, and ultimately modern alphabets. So while Ugarit itself died, its contribution to writing survived. The economic disruption caused by palace destruction was profound. The palaces had been centers of redistribution, collecting taxes and tribute, storing surpluses, distributing goods to workers. Without this system, people had to find other ways to survive. Some may have returned to subsistence farming, producing only what their own family needed. Others may have engaged in local barter, exchanging goods directly without palace intermediation. But the complex, specialized economy of the Bronze Age was gone. Trade at a distance became nearly impossible. Merchants needed security, needed to know they could travel safely, needed trading partners who could pay for goods. With palaces gone, with kingdoms collapsed, with bandits and raiders operating freely, long-distance trade was too dangerous. The few merchants who tried found that the old networks no longer functioned, that the ports they had relied on were abandoned or destroyed, that the customers they had sold to were gone. The population declined significantly in most regions. At some sites, the decline was catastrophic, from thousands of inhabitants to dozens or none. At others, the decline was less severe, but still substantial. Whether people died from violence, from starvation following the collapse of food distribution systems, from disease encouraged by overcrowding of refugees in surviving sites, or simply dispersed into smaller, less visible settlements, the end result was a much less densely populated landscape. The social complexity that had characterized Bronze Age civilization simplified dramatically. The hierarchy of kings and nobles, priests and officials, craftsmen and merchants, farmers and laborers, this complex stratification could not survive without the palace systems that maintained it. In the post-collapse world, social organization was simpler. Villages led by local chiefs or elders, no longer part of palace-administered territories. Some regions experienced the collapse more severely than others. The Greek mainland was devastated. The Levantine coast was severely disrupted. Anatolia lost its palace centers, but some areas maintained more continuity. Cyprus, though damaged, recovered somewhat. Egypt survived, though weakened. Some cities in the Levantine interior maintained occupation, though simplified. The collapse was not entirely uniform. The psychological impact of these destructions must have been immense. People who had lived in a world of palaces and kings, of literacy and administration, of trade bringing goods from distant lands, suddenly found themselves in a world where all of that was gone. The certainties of Bronze Age life, the systems that had seemed permanent, had proven fragile. The shock must have been profound. Stories may have been told around fires in the ruins, stories of what had been lost, of the great kings and the powerful palaces, of the time when bronze was abundant and ships sailed safely. These stories, evolving over generations of retelling, may have eventually become the myths and legends that later Greeks knew. The Trojan War story, the tales of Agamemnon and Odysseus, might preserve distant memories of the Bronze Age world, transformed by time and oral tradition, but retaining some core of historical truth. But on the nights when the palaces burned, there was no time for storytelling. There was only the fire, the smoke, the chaos. There was the terrified attempt to escape, to save children, to grab what could be carried. There was the desperation of people trapped by flames or by attackers. There was the sound of collapsing beams, shattering pottery, screaming. There was the heat that made stone glow, that baked clay tablets hard as rock, that turned buildings into rubble. And then, in the morning or days later, there were the ruins. The stone foundations still standing, scorched and cracked, the ash and rubble filling what had been rooms, the smell of burned wood and worse things, the silence where there had been activity, the emptiness where there had been life, and the people who survived, standing in the ruins, trying to comprehend what had happened, trying to understand how the world they had known could have ended so completely. Some sites were reoccupied, though not at palace level. Squatters might move into the ruins, living in the remains of destroyed buildings, scratching out subsistence from the land around. Others were abandoned completely, too thoroughly destroyed or too dangerous to return to. The sites became slowly buried by soil and vegetation, the stones used by later farmers for walls and buildings, the precise locations forgotten until archaeologists rediscovered them centuries or millennia later. The destruction of the palaces marked the end of an era. The Bronze Age, with its specific forms of political organization, its palace economies, its international trade networks, its literacy, was over. What would come next was not yet clear. The people living through the collapse could not know that civilization would eventually recover, that new kingdoms would arise, that literacy would return. From their perspective, the world was ending, and they could not see what, if anything, would replace it. The fires burned themselves out eventually. The ruins cooled. The survivors, if any, moved on or settled into survival in the wreckage. The Mediterranean world entered a period that modern historians call the Dark Age. Not because people stopped living, but because we have so little evidence from this period, so few written records, so much archaeological ambiguity. The lights of Bronze Age civilization, metaphorically speaking, had gone out. It would take centuries for new lights to appear. Before the end came, there were letters, clay tablets pressed with cuneiform script, messages sent between kings and officials, between cities facing crisis, between rulers seeking help that could not or would not come. These letters, preserved in archives that burned, give us the human voices behind the collapse, the fear and confusion, the desperate attempts to understand what was happening and to coordinate responses. The letters from Ugarit are particularly poignant. The city was wealthy and cosmopolitan, its harbor busy with ships, its scribes fluent in multiple languages. The king of Ugarit corresponded with the Hittite Emperor, with the king of Cyprus, with neighboring cities. In the final years, the tone of these letters changed from routine diplomatic business to increasingly urgent requests for help. One letter, found in the palace ruins, speaks of enemy ships sighted offshore. Some of the city's own ships have been burned, presumably by these enemies. The city is vulnerable. The letter asks for information, for assistance, for reassurance that help is coming. The careful diplomatic language cannot entirely conceal the fear behind it. Another letter, perhaps written slightly later, is more desperate. The king writes that the city is alone. The regular Hittite forces have been withdrawn, presumably needed elsewhere in the empire's crumbling frontiers. The city's own troops have been sent away, again probably on Hittite orders, for some campaign or crisis elsewhere. Now enemies threaten, and Ugarit has insufficient forces to defend itself. The letter begs for the return of troops, for ships, for any support that can be provided. These letters were never delivered, or if delivered, were not answered in time to make a difference. They were found in the ruins. The palace that housed them burned shortly after they were written. The help requested never came. Ugarit fell, was destroyed, was never rebuilt. The letters remain as testimony to the final days, voices from a civilization's ending. From the Hittite capital, we have different but equally telling documents, letters and administrative texts from the final years of the empire show stress and crisis. There are repeated concerns about grain supplies. The king writes to officials in Cyprus and Syria, ordering them to send grain to Hattusa immediately. The language is urgent, suggesting real crisis, famine, or near famine in the Hittite heartland. Other Hittite documents mention military mobilizations, troops being sent to various frontiers, campaigns against rebels or invaders. The empire was under pressure from multiple directions. In the west, traditional enemies and rebellious vassals. In the north, the Kaska people pressing down from the mountains. The Hittite army, which had once campaigned as far as Babylon and fought Egypt to a standstill, was now struggling to defend the empire's core territories. One letter fragment speaks of a fire, though whether this refers to a ritual burning or to destruction is unclear. The text is broken, the context lost. But it is suggestive, a whisper of the chaos that was enveloping the empire. Other documents simply stop. The administrative records that had been kept continuously for centuries cease. No more tablets recording grain deliveries, no more letters to foreign kings, no more annals recording the king's deeds. The silence is as telling as any letter. From Egypt we have different evidence. The inscriptions of Merenptah and Rameses III are not letters, but public declarations, carved in stone on temple walls, intended for eternal display. They describe invasions defeated, enemies killed, Egypt preserved by the pharaoh's valor and the gods' favor. But even in these triumphant texts, we can read the crisis. Egypt was invaded multiple times by groups it had never faced before. The traditional enemies, Libyans and Nubians, were joined or replaced by these sea peoples, coalitions of attackers whose origins were unclear. The tone of Rameses III's inscriptions is defensive in a way that earlier New Kingdom inscriptions are not. Previous pharaohs had boasted of campaigns into Syria or Nubia, of expansion and conquest. Rameses III boasts of defending Egypt, of preventing invasion, of maintaining what Egypt had. This is a significant shift, from expansion to survival, from offense to defense. Egypt was still standing, but it was standing against enormous pressure. The letters from this period, whether from Ugarit or the Hittite archives, from Mycenaean palaces or Egyptian fortresses, share certain themes. There is confusion about the identity of attackers. There is concern about supplies, especially grain, suggesting widespread crop failure or disruption. There is inability of allies to help each other, each kingdom facing its own crisis. There is breakdown of the mutual support system that had characterized Bronze Age diplomacy. In earlier periods, if one kingdom faced famine, it could request grain from neighbors, and that request would likely be honored, partly from genuine concern, partly from self-interest in maintaining good relations. But in these final years, the requests for grain are often met with refusal or silence. The Hittite king orders grain from vassals, but we do not know if it arrived. Ugarit requests military assistance from Cyprus, but Cyprus cannot provide it. The breakdown of mutual support meant that each kingdom had to face its challenges alone. This made every problem worse. A drought that might have been manageable with imported grain became a famine. A raid that might have been defeated with allied reinforcements became a disaster. The resilience of the Bronze Age system had depended on interconnection. When the connections broke, resilience failed. Some letters show attempts to understand what was happening. A Hittite king writes to another ruler asking about the movements of certain peoples. Where are they now? Where are they going? Do you have information? The letter demonstrates that the Hittites were trying to track these movements, to understand the threat, to coordinate responses. But the information network was breaking down along with everything else. The scribes who wrote these letters were performing their professional duties in increasingly desperate circumstances. They maintained the formal language of diplomacy even as the content became more urgent. They pressed their styluses into clay, forming the wedge-shaped marks that recorded Akkadian or Hittite, following the conventions they had learned in scribal school. Did they know, as they wrote, that these might be among the last letters? That the system they were part of was ending? One Ugarit letter contains a phrase that has haunted historians since its discovery. The city is described as being on fire. The exact meaning is debated. Is this metaphorical, meaning the city is under attack or in crisis? Or is it literal, meaning that parts of the city were actually burning when the letter was written? If literal, it suggests the letter was written in the very moment of the city's destruction, a final desperate message sent as the city fell. The letters that were sent and received earlier in this period, before the acute crisis, show increasing economic stress. There are references to prices being abnormally high. There are complaints about merchants not delivering promised goods. There are disputes over debts not paid. The smooth functioning of Bronze Age trade was becoming rough, the mechanisms that had facilitated exchange beginning to fail. Some letters deal with refugees, people fleeing from destroyed or threatened areas, seeking asylum in cities that were still secure. How many refugees could a city absorb? How could they be fed when food supplies were already strained? What rights did refugees have? These questions, very modern in feeling, were being asked 3,000 years ago, as the Bronze Age world disintegrated. There are letters about piracy, about ships seized, about merchants killed or robbed. The sea routes that had been relatively safe were becoming dangerous. Letters discuss organizing convoy systems, multiple ships traveling together for mutual protection. But even this became difficult as the number of available ships declined, as crews became reluctant to sail, as ports became unsafe. The administrative tablets from the final year at Pylos, discovered in the palace archive, are not letters, but lists and accounts. They record preparations for defense. Watchers are being posted along the coast. Troops are being mobilized. Bronze is being collected for making weapons. The tablets are in the dry, bureaucratic language of administration, but they document a palace preparing for attack. One tablet records offerings to be made to gods, perhaps special rituals performed in crisis, prayers for divine protection. The gods listed include Poseidon, prominent in Mycenaean religion, perhaps being asked to calm the seas or to prevent enemies from coming by sea. Whether these rituals were performed before the palace burned, we cannot know. The tablet recording them survived only because the fire baked it hard. In Egypt, the letters and inscriptions from this period also mention divine intervention. The gods fought alongside Rameses III in his battles against the Sea Peoples. Amun-Ra gave victory. The pharaoh, as a god himself, naturally triumphed over mortal enemies. This language is standard for Egyptian royal inscriptions. But in the context of the Bronze Age collapse, it may also reflect genuine belief that only divine help could save Egypt when so many other kingdoms had fallen. The letters of desperation were not just between kings. Palace officials wrote to each other about practical matters, about organizing defenses, about distributing supplies, about dealing with refugees, or with populations fleeing into the countryside. These letters show bureaucracies trying to function even as the systems they administered were breaking down. The scribes continued to write. The officials continued to issue orders, maintaining form even as substance failed. Some letters never reached their destinations. They were stored in archives awaiting dispatch, or they arrived but the recipients could not respond, or responses were sent but did not survive. The letters we have are fragments, one side of conversations we cannot fully reconstruct. They give us glimpses of the crisis, but not complete pictures. We see through a glass darkly, as people of that time must have seen, unable to comprehend the full scale of what was happening. The final letters from this period stop suddenly. Archives that had accumulated tablets for centuries have their last entries at Ugarit in the early 12th century BCE, at Hattusa around the same time, at Pylos perhaps 1180 BCE. After these dates, no more letters, no more administrative documents, no more records. The archives end not with conclusions, but with interruptions, sentences never finished, business left incomplete. Reading these letters 3,000 years later, we know how the story ends. We know that Ugarit was destroyed and never rebuilt. We know that the Hittite Empire fell and was not restored. We know that the Mycenaean palaces burned and the system they represented ended. But the people who wrote these letters did not know this. They were trying to understand, to respond, to survive. They maintained hope even in desperate circumstances, because what else could they do? The letters of desperation are evidence of crisis, but they are also evidence of humanity. In the face of destruction, people continued to communicate, to seek help, to offer what support they could, to maintain the social bonds that defined civilization. The Bronze Age was ending, but people were still behaving as people do, trying to protect their families and communities, trying to preserve what could be preserved, trying to face the unknown with whatever courage and resources they possessed. The silence that followed these letters, the absence of further records, tells its own story. Communication ceased because the systems that enabled it no longer existed. The scribes were dead or scattered. The palaces that housed archives were ruins. The kingdoms that had corresponded as equals were gone. The Bronze Age world, with its letters and diplomacy, its trade and administration, had ended. What came after would be different, simpler, more local. But the letters remain, preserved by the fires that destroyed the buildings containing them. Voices from a lost world, speaking still to those who can read them. When the dust settled and the fires burned out, when the chaos of the Bronze Age collapse finally calmed, Egypt was still standing. Not unscathed, not unchanged, but standing. Alone among the great powers of the late Bronze Age, Egypt survived as a functioning kingdom. This survival was remarkable, and it requires explanation. Rameses III fought the invaders and defeated them. His inscriptions at Medinet Habu describe two great campaigns, one on land and one at sea. The land battle was fought in the Delta, or perhaps in southern Palestine, Egyptian forces meeting a coalition of attackers that included both sea peoples and Libyans. The sea battle was fought somewhere off the coast, the Egyptian fleet engaging enemy ships, preventing them from landing. The reliefs at Medinet Habu show Egyptian soldiers and archers, chariots and infantry fighting against enemies, depicted in various costumes and using different weapons. The sea peoples are shown with distinctive feathered or horned headdresses, marking them as foreign. The Egyptian forces are shown as disciplined and organized, following the pharaoh into battle. The scenes are propaganda, showing idealized Egyptian victory. But beneath the propaganda is a historical core. Egypt did fight these battles, and Egypt did win. The naval battle is particularly interesting because it shows Egyptian naval capability. The Egyptian ships are shown with archers on deck shooting at enemy vessels. Some enemy ships are capsized, their crews drowning. The Egyptians had learned naval warfare, had developed tactics for fighting at sea, and this capability proved crucial. If the sea peoples had been able to land unopposed, the outcome might have been different. But military victory, important as it was, does not fully explain Egyptian survival. Other kingdoms had armies, had fortifications, had kings who were willing to fight. Yet they fell while Egypt endured. The explanation must involve multiple factors, structural advantages that Egypt possessed and other kingdoms lacked. Geography was one advantage. Egypt's core territory, the Nile Valley, was surrounded by desert. Invaders had to cross this desert to reach Egypt or approach by sea through the delta. This natural protection gave Egypt defense in depth. The delta fortresses provided early warning and initial resistance. If enemies broke through, they still faced the length of the Nile Valley, with Egyptian forces able to mobilize at each step. The Nile itself was another advantage. The river provided transportation, communication, and irrigation. Even during drought, the Nile continued to flow and to flood, though perhaps less reliably than usual. This meant that Egyptian agriculture, while certainly affected by the crisis, was more resilient than agriculture elsewhere that depended entirely on rain. Egypt could still produce food even when other regions were experiencing serious shortages. Egypt's political structure also provided resilience. The pharaonic system had existed for over 2,000 years by this point. It had survived previous invasions, periods of internal division, economic crises. The institutions were deep and well established. Even when individual pharaohs were weak, the system continued to function. The bureaucracy, the priesthood, the provincial administration, all of these structures had tremendous inertia, keeping Egypt organized even during difficult periods. The cultural unity of Egypt was another factor. Unlike the Hittite Empire, which ruled over many different peoples with different languages and cultures, Egypt was relatively homogeneous. Most inhabitants spoke Egyptian, worshipped Egyptian gods, identified as Egyptian. This unity made Egypt more resistant to fragmentation, harder for internal divisions to tear apart. Egypt's wealth, accumulated over centuries, provided resources to weather the crisis. The gold mines of Nubia continued to produce. The royal treasury held reserves. The temples controlled vast estates and resources. When crisis came, Egypt could afford to mobilize military forces, to maintain fortifications, to provide supplies to troops. Poorer kingdoms had less margin for error, less ability to sustain extended military campaigns. But survival came at a cost. Ramesses III's reign was followed by increasingly weak pharaohs. The later Ramesses kings, numbers 4 through 11, were mostly unremarkable rulers. The central government's power declined. The priesthood of Amun at Thebes became increasingly independent, eventually ruling Upper Egypt as a virtual kingdom within the kingdom. The New Kingdom, in its final phases, resembled earlier periods of Egyptian division more than the strong imperial power it had been under Ramesses II. Egypt's foreign holdings were lost. Syria and Palestine, which Egyptian pharaohs had campaigned in and partially controlled for centuries, were gone. The Philistines and other Sea Peoples groups settled in the southern Levantine coast, creating new kingdoms that Egypt could not dislodge. The trade routes into the Mediterranean that had made Egyptian foreign policy during the New Kingdom were closed or severely limited. The economy also suffered. International trade, which had brought copper and tin, luxury goods and exotic materials, largely ceased. Egypt became more isolated, more dependent on its own resources. The cosmopolitan culture of the New Kingdom, with its foreign influences and international connections, gave way to a more conservative, inward-looking culture. The military campaigns against the Sea Peoples had been expensive. Maintaining and supplying the army, building ships, fortifying the delta, all of this required resources that strained even Egypt's substantial wealth. After Ramesses III, Egypt didn't have the resources or will for major military adventures. The focus shifted to defense and internal administration, maintaining what Egypt had rather than expanding further. Despite these costs, Egypt maintained continuity of civilization. The hieroglyphic writing system continued in use. The temples continued to function, priests performing rituals that had been performed for millennia. The artistic traditions continued, though styles evolved. Egypt in the late period, after the New Kingdom ended, was different from New Kingdom Egypt. But it was recognizably the same civilization, maintaining its core identity. The contrast with Greece is striking. The Mycenaean palaces fell and were not rebuilt. Linear B was forgotten. The population declined dramatically. Greece entered a dark age from which it would not emerge for centuries. But Egypt continued. The pharaohs continued to rule, even if less powerfully. The administration continued to function, even if less efficiently. The culture continued to create art and literature, even if less abundantly. This continuity allowed Egypt to preserve knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. The astronomical observations, the mathematical techniques, the medical knowledge, the architectural skills, all of this was maintained in Egypt when similar knowledge was being lost elsewhere. When eventually Greece emerged from its dark age and began to develop its classical civilization, Egyptian knowledge would be available to learn from. Egypt also served as a refuge. When the palace systems collapsed elsewhere, some refugees fled to Egypt. Skilled craftsmen, literate scribes, people with knowledge and abilities that were no longer needed in their devastated homelands, might find employment in Egypt, where civilization continued to function. This influx of refugees, while creating social pressures, also brought skills and ideas that enriched Egyptian culture. The Philistines, who settled in the southern Levantine coast, one of the Sea Peoples groups, maintained their distinctive identity, but also adopted many elements of local culture. Their pottery shows a blend of Aegean and Canaanite styles. Their cities were organized differently from earlier Levantine cities, but they participated in regional trade and cultural exchange. In time, they would become one of the peoples among many in the Levantine coast, neither conquerors dominating the region nor entirely assimilated into existing populations. Egypt's relationship with these newly settled peoples evolved from initial conflict to eventual coexistence. Egyptian forces raided into southern Palestine occasionally, maintaining pressure on the Philistines and asserting nominal suzerainty. But Egypt did not attempt reconquest. The age of Egyptian empire was over. Egypt accepted a new geopolitical reality in which it was one power among several rather than the dominant force. This acceptance was, in its own way, an adaptation. Egypt had survived by being flexible as well as strong, by adapting to new circumstances while maintaining core elements of its identity. The pharaonic ideology claimed eternal and unchanging power, but the reality was that Egypt had always changed, had always adapted, had always found ways to survive. The Bronze Age collapse was a more severe test than most, but Egypt passed the test. The wisdom literature from this period shows Egyptian reflection on the crisis. There are texts that speak of chaos and disorder, of the world turned upside down, of foreigners in positions of authority, of things not being as they should be. These texts are not historical accounts, but moral and philosophical reflections, using the crisis to make points about proper behavior and divine order. Yet they preserve the memory that something terrible had happened, that the world had changed. The religious response to the crisis is also visible. There was increased emphasis on divine protection, on the gods as defenders of Egypt against chaos. The association of the pharaoh with the gods as a bulwark against disorder was strengthened. The rituals performed in temples took on added importance, maintaining Mayat in a world where order had proven more fragile than assumed. In the Delta, life gradually returned to normal, or to a new normal. The fortresses that had defended against invasion were maintained, but the immediate threat receded. Trade recovered somewhat, though never to Bronze Age levels. Ships sailed again, but more cautiously, on shorter routes. Merchants operated, but with less capital and on smaller scales. The economy functioned, but as a shadow of its former self. In the great temples, priests continued their rituals, maintaining traditions that stretched back to the beginning of Egyptian history. The temple of Karnak continued to expand, later pharaohs adding to the complex, asserting their legitimacy through association with past greatness. The temple remained a center of religious life, of learning, of economic power. In the continuity of temple ritual, Egypt found stability. The survival of Egypt demonstrates that the Bronze Age collapse, while catastrophic, was not absolutely deterministic. Societies could survive if they had the right combination of resources, structure, geography, and perhaps luck. Egypt had all of these. The desert protected it, the Nile sustained it, the pharaonic system organized it, the cultural traditions unified it, military force defended it, and perhaps fortune favored it. But Egypt's survival also demonstrates the cost of survival. Egypt continued, but it was diminished. The empire was gone. The wealth was reduced. The power was limited. The confidence was shaken. Egypt would continue for another 1,000 years and more, through periods of resurgence and decline, eventually falling to Persian conquest, and then to Alexander the Great. But it would never again dominate the eastern Mediterranean as it had in the New Kingdom. On an evening after the crisis had passed, perhaps during the reign of one of the later Ramesses kings, the sun would still have set over the Nile, the river still flowing as it always had. The temples would still have stood, their walls carved with ancient inscriptions. The fields would still have been worked, the harvest still gathered. The rhythms of life continued, changed, but not broken. In the palace at Thebes or the temples at Karnak, priests would have performed the evening rituals, closing the sanctuary doors, sealing the gods in for the night. The familiar prayers would have been recited, where the familiar offerings made. In the continuity of ritual, in the persistence of tradition, Egypt found its identity and its resilience. The Nile flowed north as it always had, the current carrying boats and silt, carrying life itself down to the delta and out to the Mediterranean. The desert on either side remained harsh and protective. The sun rose and set, marking the days, the years, the centuries. Egypt endured, survivor of a catastrophe that had destroyed the world around it, carrier of Bronze Age civilization into the Iron Age that was coming. The world that emerged from the Bronze Age collapse was quieter, emptier, simpler. The great palaces were ruins, their walls still standing in places but roofless, their rooms filled with rubble, their courtyards overgrown. The cities that had bustled with activity were abandoned or shrunken to small settlements, clinging to a corner of their former extent. The roads that had carried trade caravans and diplomatic missions were overgrown or forgotten. The merchants and messengers gone. The population had declined dramatically in most regions. The Greek mainland, which had supported thousands of people in dozens of settlements during the Mycenaean period, was now sparsely inhabited. Many sites were completely abandoned. Those that continued to be occupied had much smaller populations. Instead of palatial centers with hundreds or thousands of residents, there were now villages with dozens of families, living in simple houses, working small farms. Without the palace systems to organize economic activity, people reverted to simpler modes of subsistence. Farming became more localized, families or small communities producing what they needed for themselves, rather than for palatial redistribution. The specialization that had characterized Bronze Age economy largely disappeared. Most people needed to be generalists, able to farm and herd, to make basic tools and pottery, to provide for themselves without relying on exchange. The material culture became simpler and less varied. Pottery in post-collapse Greece is less elaborate than Mycenaean pottery had been. The shapes are simpler, the decoration more geometric and less naturalistic. The finest Mycenaean pottery had been decorated with marine scenes, octopi and dolphins, or with elaborate patterns. The pottery of the early Iron Age is decorated with simple, geometric patterns, lines and zigzags, basic shapes. This simplification reflects both the loss of specialized craftsmen and the loss of wealth that had supported fine craftsmanship. Architecture also became simpler. The monumental stone architecture of the Bronze Age palaces was not replicated. People built with humbler materials, houses of mud brick or stone at the foundation, with wooden posts and thatched roofs. These structures were adequate for shelter, but lacked the permanence and impressiveness of Bronze Age buildings. They were also less visible archaeologically, more likely to decay completely, leaving few traces for excavators to find. Bronze became scarce. Without the trade networks that had brought copper, and especially tin, bronze production declined sharply. Old bronze objects were carefully recycled, melted down, and recast into new forms. But the total amount of bronze available shrank. This created pressure to find alternatives, leading eventually to increased use of iron, which was harder to work but available from local sources in many regions. The transition to iron was gradual, occurring over several centuries. Iron had been known in the Bronze Age, but was rare and difficult to work, used mainly for decorative items or as diplomatic gifts. In the early Iron Age, iron began to be used more commonly for tools and weapons, as the knowledge of iron working spread, and as bronze became too scarce and expensive for routine use. Iron working requires different techniques than bronze working. Iron melts at a higher temperature than bronze, too high for Bronze Age furnaces to make iron flow like liquid. Instead, iron working involves heating the metal to a high temperature and then hammering it, forging it into shape. This technique, once mastered, allowed iron to be worked without having to melt it completely, making iron working possible with simpler equipment than bronze casting required. But the iron technology developed slowly. Early iron was often inferior to bronze, more brittle, more likely to break. Only gradually did smiths learn techniques to produce high-quality iron, and eventually steel, carbon-rich iron that held an edge better than bronze and was less likely to break. This technological development was one of the few progressive changes in the otherwise regressive post-collapse world. Literacy disappeared in Greece, as mentioned earlier. Linear B was forgotten when the palaces fell. For approximately 400 years, Greece had no writing system. The alphabetic script that eventually was adopted, borrowed from the Phoenicians in the 8th century BCE, was different from Linear B, simpler and more flexible, used not just for palace administration, but for all purposes, including literature and private communication. But during the intervening centuries, knowledge had to be preserved orally, or not at all. This loss of literacy meant that detailed records were no longer kept. We have no administrative documents, no diplomatic correspondence, no historical annals from Greece during this period. Our knowledge comes almost entirely from archaeology, from the physical remains, from pottery and buildings, from tombs and the objects placed in them. We can infer something of how people lived, but we lack their voices, their own accounts of their lives and times. The oral tradition did preserve some memories. The myths and legends that were eventually written down by Homer and others probably originated in part from stories told during the Dark Age, stories that themselves preserved memories of the Bronze Age. But oral tradition transforms as it transmits, stories changing to fit the concerns and understandings of each generation that tells them. By the time Homer composed the Iliad and Odyssey in the 8th century BCE, the Bronze Age was half a millennium in the past, and the details in the poems mix memories of the Bronze Age with elements from Homer's own time and from intervening centuries. Trade continued, but at a much reduced level. Local and regional exchange never entirely stopped. People still needed things they could not produce themselves. But the long-distance trade that had characterized the Bronze Age was largely gone. Tin from Central Asia no longer reached the Mediterranean in quantity. Copper from Cyprus was less available. The manufactured goods that had traveled across the Mediterranean, the decorated pottery and carved ivory, the fine textiles and exotic luxuries were no longer common. The Mediterranean Sea, which had been a highway for Bronze Age trade, became more of a barrier. Ships still sailed, but less frequently and on shorter routes. Island hopping remained possible, but the long voyages directly across open water became rare. Pirates and raiders made sea travel dangerous, and there were fewer merchants willing to take the risk, fewer cargoes valuable enough to justify the danger. In some regions, population movement continued for some time after the initial collapses. Groups displaced by the destructions sought new homes. Some refugees were absorbed into existing communities. Others established new settlements in previously marginal areas. The movement of Greek speakers to the western coast of Anatolia and to many Aegean islands, traditionally dated to this period, may represent refugees fleeing the devastation on the Greek mainland. This migration to Ionia, as the western Anatolian coast came to be called, would eventually have important consequences for Greek culture. Ionian cities, like Miletus and Ephesus, would become prosperous and culturally significant. The Ionian Greeks, living in contact with Near Eastern civilizations, would later play important roles in the development of Greek philosophy, science, and literature. But in the immediate aftermath of the collapse, the migrants were simply refugees, seeking safety and survival in a dangerous world. Cyprus experienced a complex pattern of destruction and recovery. Some sites on Cyprus were destroyed, but others continued, and new settlements were founded by migrants from the Greek mainland and perhaps from the Levantine coast. Cyprus maintained contact with both the Aegean and the Near East, serving as an intermediary even when direct contact between these regions declined. The copper mines of Cyprus continued to produce, though at lower levels than during the Bronze Age peak. In the Levantine coast, the Phoenician cities gradually emerged as the successors to the destroyed Bronze Age trading cities. Cities like Tyre and Sidon maintained maritime traditions, building ships, training sailors, engaging in trade. The Phoenicians would eventually become the dominant maritime traders of the eastern Mediterranean, establishing colonies as far as Spain and North Africa, serving as intermediaries between the Near East and the expanding Greek world. But this development took time. In the immediate aftermath of the collapse, the Levantine coast was as disrupted as everywhere else. The Hebrew Bible preserves traditions about this period, though dating and interpreting these traditions is complex. The stories of the Israelite settlement in Canaan, of the period of the Judges, may relate to the confused conditions following the Bronze Age collapse. small tribal groups operating in the highlands, periodic conflicts with more organized neighbors like the Philistines, the absence of strong centralized kingdoms, all of this fits with what we know of the post-collapse Levant. In Anatolia, the Hittite Empire's fall left a power vacuum. Neo-Hittite states in southern Anatolia and northern Syria maintained elements of Hittite culture but were small kingdoms compared to the empire. Other groups moved into Anatolia. The Phrygians, who would eventually establish a kingdom in central Anatolia with its capital at Gordion, may have arrived during this period of disruption. The later kingdom of Lydia in western Anatolia may also have roots in the post-collapse settlements. The cultural memory of the Bronze Age persisted in various forms. In Greece, the ruins of Mycenaean palaces were visible reminders of a past age of power. Later Greeks, seeing the massive walls, created legends about giants and heroes. The stories of Agamemnon at Mycenae, of Nestor at Pylos, of Menelaus at Sparta, preserved in a folk memory the existence of palace centers, even if the details were transformed by centuries of oral tradition. In Egypt, the continuity of civilization meant that the memory of the crisis was preserved more directly. The temples maintained records, king lists, inscriptions that documented the invasions of sea peoples and their defeat. Egyptian historical consciousness included the Bronze Age collapse as a historical event, a crisis that was survived, a testimony to Egyptian resilience and divine protection. The quiet that descended after the collapse was not absolute. There were still conflicts, raids, small wars between communities competing for resources, but the scale of violence was smaller than the destructions of the collapse itself. Without palace systems to organize large armies, without bronze in quantity to equip them, warfare became more limited. Raids by small groups rather than campaigns by professional armies became the norm. Life for most people probably became harder in material terms. Without palace redistribution, without specialized craftsmen, without trade bringing goods from distance, people had to be more self-sufficient. This meant more work for less output, lower living standards, less leisure time for activities beyond basic subsistence. The surplus that had supported Bronze Age civilization was gone, and without it, civilization itself was reduced. But human adaptability should not be underestimated. People found ways to survive, to maintain families and communities, to continue patterns of life that make human existence meaningful. Without palaces to demand taxes, farmers kept more of what they produced. Without scribal administrators to track everything, there was more personal freedom, even if also more insecurity. The trade-off between complexity and simplicity has costs and benefits both ways. The post-collapse communities developed their own forms of organization, chieftains or councils of elders, structures appropriate to their smaller scale. These forms of governance were less sophisticated than Bronze Age palace bureaucracy, but they functioned adequately for the needs of small communities. People solved problems locally, relied on immediate neighbors, created social bonds that did not depend on palace mediation. Religion continued, though perhaps in modified forms. The gods of the Bronze Age remained, but without palace temples and professional priesthoods, worship became more informal. Offerings were made at rural shrines rather than in monumental temples. Rituals were simpler, led by local priests or family heads rather than trained temple staff. but the connections to divine forces, the attempt to maintain right relationship with powers beyond human control, continued as it had always continued. The oral culture of the post-collapse period developed storytelling traditions that would eventually produce Homer's epics and other legendary narratives. Around fires in the evening, bards sang of heroes and gods, of past glories and tragic falls. These stories entertained, but they also educated, transmitted values, maintained cultural identity. The bardic tradition would bridge the Dark Age, preserving memories until literacy returned, and these oral compositions could be written down. The centuries following the Bronze Age collapse were not entirely static. Cultural evolution continued, new pottery styles developed, iron-working knowledge spread, communities grew or moved, social structures adapted. But the pace of change was slower than during the Bronze Age, and the trajectory was not obviously progressive. There was no clear movement toward greater complexity or sophistication. Instead, there was consolidation at a simpler level, a stable equilibrium at lower population and lower material culture. This period is called a Dark Age, partly because we know little about it, and partly because what we do know suggests cultural decline from Bronze Age heights. But from the perspective of people living through it, it was simply life, with its challenges and satisfactions, its joys and sorrows. Children grew up knowing no other world. The Bronze Age was history, if remembered at all, stories of a legendary past rather than living memory. The quiet aftermath lasted for centuries, roughly from 1100 to 800 BCE in Greece, with regional variations. During this time, the foundations were being laid for what would come next. The Phoenician alphabet that would be adopted by the Greeks was being developed. The iron-working techniques that would make iron the dominant metal were being refined. The social and political structures that would eventually produce the Greek city-states were evolving. The recovery, when it came, would build on what survived and what was learned during the Dark Age. Slowly, gradually, over generations, the Mediterranean world began to recover. The recovery was not a return to Bronze Age patterns, but a development of new ones. The Iron Age that emerged from the Dark Age was different from the Bronze Age it succeeded, based on different technologies, different political structures, different economic systems. But it was a recovery nonetheless, civilization rebuilding itself in new forms. Iron became the dominant metal, giving the age its name. Iron tools and weapons became common, more common than bronze had ever been. This democratization of metal technology had profound effects. Bronze, depending on rare tin, had been controlled by elites, produced in palace workshops, distributed by administrative fiat. Iron, available from local sources in many regions, could be produced more independently. A small community could have its own blacksmith, producing iron tools for local use without depending on long-distance trade or palace redistribution. This shift in technology enabled new patterns of settlement and organization. Communities could be more self-sufficient, less dependent on connections to palace centers. This encouraged dispersed settlement, many small communities, rather than concentration around palaces. In Greece, this pattern eventually led to the polis, the city-state, an independent political community of citizens, quite different from the palace kingdoms of the Bronze Age. Trade gradually recovered, but in new patterns. The Phoenicians, operating from cities like Tyre and Sidon, became the Mediterranean's dominant maritime traders. They established trade routes throughout the Mediterranean, founding colonies in North Africa, Sicily, Sardinia, and as far west as Spain. The Phoenician colony at Carthage, founded according to tradition in 814 BCE, would eventually become one of the major powers of the Mediterranean, rival to Rome itself. The Phoenicians traded in many goods, but they were particularly known for textiles, especially cloth dyed with the famous Tyrian purple, made from sea snails, expensive and prestigious. They also carried metals, tin from Spain, silver from various sources, copper, and iron. Their ships ranged widely, sometimes venturing beyond the Strait of Gibraltar into the Atlantic. The maritime knowledge and shipbuilding skills of the Bronze Age, preserved in the Phoenician cities, were put to new uses in the Iron Age. The Greek world also began to recover. Population increased. New settlements were founded. By the 8th century BCE, Greece was experiencing a renaissance. The alphabet was adopted from the Phoenicians around 800 BCE, bringing literacy back to Greece after 4 centuries without writing. But the new writing system was different from Linear B. The alphabet could be learned relatively easily, was used for all purposes, and was not restricted to palace scribes. The adoption of the alphabet had transformative effects. It enabled the recording of Homer's epics, preserving oral traditions in written form. It allowed the development of written law, reducing arbitrary rule and enabling more complex political systems. It facilitated trade by allowing contracts and accounts to be recorded. It enabled philosophy and historical writing, which would become distinctive features of Greek culture. The alphabet was perhaps as important to the development of classical Greek civilization as any other single factor. Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, probably composed in the 8th century BCE, look back to the Bronze Age, though through the lens of intervening centuries. The heroes fight in single combat, a practice that may reflect Homer's own time more than the Bronze Age. But the setting is clearly meant to be the Mycenaean age, kings ruling from palace citadels, warriors using bronze weapons, a world of heroes and gods. The poems preserve distorted but real memories of the Bronze Age, transmitted orally for centuries before being written down. The Greek polis, the city-state, emerged as the characteristic political form of Iron Age Greece. Each polis was independent, governed by its own laws, often competing or fighting with neighboring polis. The citizen body of each polis governed itself, developing forms of collective decision-making that would eventually lead to democracy in cities like Athens. This political structure was completely different from the Bronze Age palace kingdoms, reflecting the different circumstances of the Iron Age. Colonization was another feature of the emerging Iron Age. Both Greeks and Phoenicians established colonies around the Mediterranean, responding to population pressure, seeking trade opportunities, looking for agricultural land. Greek colonies spread throughout the Mediterranean and Black Sea, from Spain to the eastern Black Sea coast, from southern France to Libya. These colonies maintained connections to their mother cities, but were politically independent, each a new polis in a new location. In the Near East, new empires arose. The Neo-Assyrian Empire expanded from its heartland in northern Mesopotamia, eventually dominating much of the Near East. The Assyrians were fierce warriors, using iron weapons effectively, developing sophisticated siege techniques. Their empire, at its height in the 7th century BCE, was larger than any Bronze Age kingdom had been, stretching from Egypt to the Persian Gulf, from Anatolia to the Arabian Desert. But the Neo-Assyrian Empire was different from Bronze Age kingdoms in important ways. It was more militaristic, more centralized, more brutal in its treatment of conquered peoples. The Assyrians practiced mass deportation, moving populations from their homelands to other parts of the empire to prevent rebellion. This practice created ethnic mixing and cultural disruption, quite different from the Bronze Age pattern, where most populations remained in their ancestral territories. The Neo-Assyrian Empire eventually fell to a coalition of Medes and Babylonians in the late 7th century BCE. Nineveh, the Assyrian capital, was destroyed, and the empire collapsed with remarkable speed. The Babylonians briefly dominated Mesopotamia before being conquered by the Persians in 539 BCE. The Persian Empire would become the largest yet, eventually controlling territory from the Indus to the Mediterranean, from Central Asia to Egypt. Egypt, which had survived the Bronze Age collapse, experienced its own long decline. The new kingdom ended around 1070 BCE, followed by the Third Intermediate Period, a time of division and foreign influence. Egypt was invaded by Libyans, then by Nubians, then by Assyrians. Each invader adopted Egyptian royal ideology, ruling as pharaohs, maintaining the forms of Egyptian kingship, while actual power often rested elsewhere. Egypt's cultural continuity persisted even as its political independence was lost. In the 7th century BCE, Egypt briefly regained independence under native pharaohs, but this resurgence was short-lived. The Persians conquered Egypt in 525 BCE, making it a province of their empire. Egypt would remain under foreign rule for most of the next 2,500 years through Persian, Macedonian, Roman, Byzantine, Arab, Ottoman, and British control, finally regaining independence only in the 20th century CE. Yet through all of this, Egyptian cultural identity persisted, an extraordinary example of cultural continuity despite political subjugation. The Iron Age saw the development of new forms of cultural expression. In Greece, lyric poetry emerged, personal expressions of individual experience, quite different from the epic poetry about heroes that had dominated the Dark Age. Philosophy began as Ionian Greeks started to question traditional explanations, seeking natural rather than mythological causes for phenomena. History emerged as a distinct genre, Herodotus and Thucydides investigating past events, trying to understand what actually happened and why. Art also evolved. The geometric patterns of early Iron Age pottery gave way to more naturalistic styles. The human figure returned to Greek art, depicted in increasingly realistic ways. Sculpture developed from simple forms to the sophisticated realism of classical Greek art. The temples built in the Iron Age were more elaborate than anything from the Dark Age, using stone column architecture, decorated with sculptural programs, expressing religious devotion and civic pride. The Iron Age also saw technological advances beyond metallurgy. Shipbuilding improved, producing vessels capable of longer voyages and carrying larger cargoes. The trireme, a Greek warship with 3 banks of oars, represented a sophisticated design allowing speed and maneuverability. Agricultural techniques improved, terracing allowing cultivation of hillsides, more efficient plows increasing productivity. Pottery technology advanced, producing finer vessels with better decoration. Economically, the Iron Age saw the development of coinage, a major innovation. Coins, small pieces of precious metal stamped to guarantee weight and purity, facilitated trade by providing a standard, portable medium of exchange. The first coins appeared in Lydia in western Anatolia in the 7th century BCE. The technology spread rapidly, adopted by Greek cities, by Persia, by many Mediterranean civilizations. Coinage enabled more complex economic transactions than barter, supporting the growth of trade and urban economies. Socially, the Iron Age saw the development of more complex class structures. In Greek polis, citizens formed a political community, but were supported by non-citizens, including slaves. In Near Eastern empires, social hierarchies were elaborate, from the king through various levels of officials and priests, merchants and craftsmen, farmers and laborers, slaves. These hierarchies were different from Bronze Age patterns, but equally complex, reflecting the recovery of social complexity after the Dark Age simplicity. Religiously, the Iron Age saw both continuity and change. The old gods persisted, Zeus and Athena, Baal and Astarte, but new emphasis and interpretations appeared. In Greece, the Olympian gods of the polis temples were supplemented by mystery cults promising personal salvation. In the Near East, monotheistic tendencies appeared, most notably in Judaism, which developed during the Iron Age into a distinct religious tradition. The Persian religion of Zoroastrianism, with its dualism of good and evil, would influence later religious developments, including Christianity. The Iron Age Mediterranean world was more divided than the Bronze Age world had been. Instead of a few palace kingdoms in diplomatic contact, there were many independent city-states and several large empires. The level of political fragmentation, especially in Greece, was higher than during the Bronze Age. But this fragmentation encouraged cultural diversity, each city or region developing its own traditions, creating the cultural richness that would characterize classical Mediterranean civilization. The differences between Bronze Age and Iron Age civilizations were fundamental. Bronze Age civilization had been palace-centered, with redistributive economies, bureaucratic administration, limited literacy, and relatively few political centers. Iron Age civilization was more diverse, with many forms of political organization, market economies alongside redistributive systems, widespread literacy, greater social mobility. The collapse had destroyed one form of civilization, but in time, new forms had emerged, different but equally complex. Yet there were also continuities. The geographical framework remained the same. The Mediterranean Sea continued to connect the civilizations around it. Agricultural techniques built on older knowledge. Many religious traditions maintained Bronze Age elements, transformed but recognizable. Cultural memories of the Bronze Age persisted in myth and legend, influencing Iron Age imaginations. The Iron Age did not start from zero, but built on what survived the collapse. By the 5th century BCE, about 700 years after the Bronze Age collapse, the Mediterranean world had recovered fully and had developed new forms of complexity and sophistication. Classical Athens, at the height of its power and culture, represented achievement in politics, philosophy, art, and literature that equaled or exceeded anything the Bronze Age had produced, though in different forms. The Persian Empire controlled territory beyond anything Bronze Age kings had imagined. Phoenician and Greek colonies dotted the entire Mediterranean coast. The memory of the Bronze Age collapse itself had largely faded. The Greeks knew the ruins of Mycenaean and attributed them to heroes of legend. The Egyptians remembered invasions by sea peoples, but as one event among many in their long history. The collapse was not forgotten, but was no longer a living memory, having become history and legend, interpreted through the concerns of Iron Age civilizations that were themselves now old and established. As evening came over the Mediterranean world, perhaps in the 5th century BCE, the scene was very different from an evening in the late Bronze Age. Ships in harbours were sleeker and more sophisticated. Merchant vessels from Phoenicia, Greek triremes, Persian tribute ships. The cities were built of stone, with temples and public buildings, walls and gates, marketplaces bustling with activity. The population was larger, the settlement pattern denser, the economic activity more varied. In a Greek polis, citizens might gather in the agora, the public square, discussing politics, philosophy, the affairs of the day. In a Phoenician port, merchants negotiated deals, scribes recorded transactions in alphabetic script, cargo was loaded and unloaded. In an Egyptian temple, priests performed rituals that their ancestors had performed for 3,000 years, maintaining traditions that had survived the Bronze Age collapse, and would survive many more crises. The Bronze Age was gone, its palaces ruined, its scripts forgotten, its networks broken. But civilization had returned in new forms, adapted to new circumstances, building on old foundations, even when those foundations were no longer visible. The collapse had been catastrophic, but it had not been final. Humanity had recovered, as humanity always does, finding new ways to organize, to create, to connect. The Dark Age had ended. The light of a new age, the Iron Age transitioning toward the classical world, shone over the Mediterranean. And in that light, people lived their lives as people always have, working and loving, building and creating, hoping and fearing, connected to the past by threads of memory and tradition, facing the future with the courage and resilience that had carried humanity through the collapse and would carry it through whatever challenges lay ahead. The story of the Bronze Age collapse is a story of ending and beginning, of loss and survival, of destruction and renewal. It reminds us that civilizations are fragile, that complex systems can break, that disaster can strike even the most powerful kingdoms. But it also reminds us that humanity persists, that culture survives even when states fall, that from the ruins of the old, the new eventually emerges. The Bronze Age ended, but the story continued. It continues still. And now, as you drift toward sleep, let the images of ancient shores and quiet ruins, of ships on calm seas and distant fires fading, carry you gently into rest. The story of the Bronze Age collapse has been told, as it has been told many times across the centuries, a reminder of what was and what came after, a tale for the evening, a meditation on time and change and the eternal patterns of human experience. Sleep well.